In the ashes of a broken kingdom, a young prince watched everything he knew collapse into chaos, kingless, hunted, and betrayed. Charles Stuart wandered through a land torn apart by civil war, his father executed, his crown stolen, his enemies everywhere. Yet from the shadows of defeat, he would rise as the king who rebuilt a shattered monarchy and forged the foundations of a new British Empire. But Charles II's return to the throne was no fairy tale. It was forged in blood, exile, rebellion, secret deals with foreign powers, forbidden loves, and a relentless battle to restore the power of a crown nearly destroyed. His life was a story of survival, his reign a story of rebirth. His empire, born from war, won the birth of a Warborn King, King Charles II. Title: Warborn Kings. Rise of the British Empire. The night Charles Stuart entered the world on May 29, 1630. A storm hammered the windows of St. James's Palace. Charles was the first surviving son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess whose presence in Protestant England stirred distrust and political tension from the very beginning. Even in infancy, Charles's life was tangled in the deepening conflict between his father and Parliament. He was raised in royal chambers filled with jewels, tutors, foreign diplomats, and the quiet, constant rumble of political disagreement. His childhood education was intense. Philosophy, languages, fencing, theology, all meant to mold him into a future king. But what truly shaped him were the conversations he overheard at dusk, when his father's advisors whispered about Parliament's growing defiance, Puritan uprisings, and the rumors of civil war. By age 10, Charles was old enough to understand the shadows in the palace. The palace corridors felt colder every year. Parliament challenged the crown's power, taxes, religion, royal authority. Everything was questioned, and through it all, Charles watched his father argue, negotiate, and ultimately struggle to control a kingdom splintering apart. The boy who should have grown up in luxury instead grew up with fear tightening around the monarchy. Charles admired his father's dignity and unbending royal belief in divine right. Yet he also saw Parliament's growing influence and the resentment boiling among the people. He saw the divide widening, year after year, a warning that the crown was no longer safe. By 1642, when Charles was just 12, swords finally left their scabbards. The English Civil War erupted. Royal banners rose, parliamentary cannons thundered, and England fell into bloodshed. It was in this crucible, not a peaceful court, that the future Charles II was shaped, not as a prince of comfort, but as a Warborn King, destined to rise through loss, exile, betrayal, and eventually the restoration of a wounded empire. To a prince on the run, the fall of the crown King Charles II. The year was 1646, when the world Charles knew finally collapsed. The boy who once walked palace halls now fled across muddy fields, slipping through enemy territory as Parliament's forces closed in around the royal family. His father's armies were losing battle after battle, and the Stuarts' power, once unquestioned, was crumbling. Charles was only 16 when he first tasted real fear. Not the fear whispered by tutors or painted in political arguments, but the fear of capture, death, and humiliation. Royalists were hunted. Safe houses turned unsafe within hours, and every ally could become a traitor if the price was high enough. His mother had already escaped to France, begging foreign courts for support. His younger siblings were scattered, and Charles, he moved like a shadow, sometimes disguised as a servant, sometimes hidden in barns, sometimes smuggled in the dead of night by loyalists who risked everything to protect him. He watched from a distance as the parliamentary army seized royal fortresses one after another. He listened to reports of starvation in besieged cities, of captured royalist commanders, and of a kingdom turning against its own king. But nothing crushed him more than the moment he learned the truth. Charles I had surrendered. The once mighty monarch, defender of divine right, had placed himself in enemy hands, and everyone knew Parliament wouldn't let him walk free. Charles II's world froze. His father had been his role model, his anchor, the embodiment of royal dignity. And now that anchor was in chains, surrounded by men who believed the monarchy itself was a threat to the nation. Charles fled to the Isles of Scilly to herself. Then finally, across the sea to France. Each journey stripped away another layer of his old royal identity. The courtiers were fewer, the money was tighter, the assurances emptier. By 1648, when civil war flared again, Charles desperately hoped the royalists could still save his father. He even tried to rally forces in exile, but every plan collapsed before it began. Too little money, too few soldiers, too many factions. Then came the message he feared most. A cold, simple message, a death sentence. Parliament had decided the king must die. Charles raced across Europe, begging for ships, soldiers, anything. But he was too late. On January 30th, 1649, Charles Stuart, King of England, was executed before a silent, horrified crowd. The axe fell, and with it, centuries of unbroken monarchy. Charles II was no longer a prince in hiding. He was the rightful king, with no crown, no army, and no country. The British monarchy had fallen, and the young man meant to lead it was now a king without a kingdom, forced to wander Europe as a political refugee while England transformed into a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Yet exile did not weaken him. It hardened him. It taught him patience, diplomacy, survival, and disguise. It forged the instincts of a king who would one day reclaim a broken empire. The Warborn King had lost everything, but he had only just begun his rise. 3. The Exiled Prince. The Making of a Warborn King. Title: Warborn Kings. Rise of the British Empire. Charles the world collapsed the moment Parliament declared the monarchy dissolved in England a commonwealth. A king had ruled England for 1,000 years. Yet in one brutal stroke, the monarchy was erased, and Charles became a fugitive in his own kingdom. He was 19 when news reached him in Holland. His father, King Charles I, had been executed. Not killed in battle, not son, but publicly beheaded by order of his own subjects. Witnesses would later say, Charles collapsed when he heard the words. Others claimed he stood frozen, tears burning silently down his face. But what every witness agreed on was this: a part of Charles died with his father. The prince who once walked palace halls now walked foreign streets, hunted by Cromwell's spies, dependent on handouts, his royal clothes replaced by borrowed coats. Kings were meant to command armies, not beg for shelter, but exile carved humility into Charles's bones. He moved between France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, living in borrowed rooms, often sleeping on floors, sometimes going hungry. Once he pawned his last ring just to pay for food. Former allies abandoned him. Nobles doubted him, and Europe saw him as a broken prince of a fallen house. But exile hardened Charles. Every betrayal taught him caution. Every loss taught him patience. Every humiliating hunger taught him endurance. And in exile, Charles discovered a truth his father never learned. A king survives not by divine right, but by political mastery. He forged alliances quietly with Scottish Covenanters, with Catholic nobles, with foreign courts eager to weaken Cromwell. He learned to negotiate like a diplomat, deceive like a spy, and charm like a future king who needed every friend he could get. By 1650, he struck a desperate bargain. The Scots would crown him King of Scotland if he accepted their religious demands. Charles agreed not from devotion, but from necessity. He was crowned at Scone, but it was a cold coronation, watched by wary eyes and guarded by soldiers who doubted him. Still, it was a crown and a foothold against Cromwell. But Cromwell was ruthless. His new model army crushed Charles's forces at the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Charles barely escaped with his life. For 6 desperate weeks, he hid, disguised as a servant, slipping through villages, sleeping in barns, relying on strangers who risked death to protect him. He famously hid inside an oak tree while parliamentary soldiers searched below, so close he could hear their breath. That moment became legend, the tree that saved a throne. After countless escapes, he fled again to Europe, 20 years old, exiled, defeated, but not broken. In exile, Charles matured into a cunning, strategic, and worldly man. A king forged not in palace gold, but in the smoke of war and the hunger of wandering, and though the empire he would one day rule was still far from restored, the lessons of exile became the weapon that would eventually bring him home. The Warborn King was still rising. For the return of the king, King Charles II, title, Warborn Kings. Rise of the British Empire Exile had carved Charles Stuart into a man of charm, caution, and iron-haired survival instinct. But by 1658, the tides of England were shifting. Oliver Cromwell, the man who shattered the monarchy, executed Charles I, and ruled as Lord Protector, was dead. His son, Richard Cromwell, inherited nothing but a collapsing regime. Factions fought. The army rebelled. Parliament splintered. England groaned under the weight of chaos, and across the sea, in Breda, Charles waited. He had spent years wandering Europe with empty pockets, dodging assassins, begging kings for support, and trying desperately to reclaim his father's throne. But this time, England called him. General George Monk, commander of the English army in Scotland, secretly opened negotiations with the exiled prince. Parliament wanted stability. The army wanted order. The people wanted peace. England wanted a king. Charles understood the moment perfectly. He had learned patience in exile, diplomacy in poverty, and strategy in survival. Now, he crafted the Declaration of Breda, promising a future that England could believe in. Forgiveness for old enemies, protection of property, religious tolerance, and cooperation with Parliament. It was everything his father never offered, and everything England needed to hear. The plan worked like magic. In April 1660, Parliament proclaimed that the government is, and ought to be, by king, lords, and commons. The monarchy was restored. On May 23, 1660, Charles boarded the ship, Naseby, renamed Royal Charles, and sailed for home. As he stepped onto English soil after 9 years in exile, crowds erupted, bells rang. Streets filled with banners, thousands shouted his name. London had not seen such celebration in decades, but beneath the cheers, Charles felt a heavier truth. He was returning, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of healing for a nation broken by civil war. The scars of his father's death, Cromwell's rule, and years of bitter division still lingered. Yet this moment was his victory. A prince driven out by war had returned as a king, chosen by his people. Charles II, the Warborn King, had reclaimed the British throne. 5. The Restoration King, reborn King Charles II. Title, Warborn Kings. Rise of the British Empire. The year 1661 was unlike anything Charles had ever lived through. For the first time in his life, the young man who had fled across countries, begged foreign crowns for shelter, disguised himself as a commoner, and survived the execution of his own father, finally stood on English soil not as an exile, but as a king. Yet the restoration was not simply a celebration. It was a resurrection of monarchy, of national identity, and of a man whose life had been carved by war and wandering. London welcomed him with thunderous joy. Streets overflowed, bonfires roared into the night, and church bells cried across the city with a frenzy that overwhelmed the king who had once hidden in a tree to save his life. People climbed rooftops just to glimpse him, shouting, "Long live the king! God save Charles II." But beneath the celebrations, Charles sensed the truth. He was inheriting a kingdom broken by decades of civil war, religious hatred, and political distrust. To rule it, he would need more than charm. He would need strategy, tolerance, and iron discipline wrapped beneath a velvet smile. A king of contradictions. Charles II stepped into the throne room with a different understanding of power than any king before him. Exile had taught him humility, loss had taught him caution, and survival had taught him the art of masking his true thoughts behind wit and elegance. He rebuilt Parliament's trust through compromise, knowing the monarchy could no longer rule as it had under his father. He embraced public festivities, theater, fashion, and scientific innovation, allowing England to breathe again after the suffocating Puritan rule of Cromwell. Plays reopened, music returned, wine flowed. London blossomed with color and laughter. something it had not experienced in over a decade. The king, who once dined on stale bread while escaping Cromwell's soldiers, now hosted extravagant banquets, surrounded by poets, philosophers, mistresses, spies, and diplomats. But Charles was not blind to the darker shadows lurking behind the Jubilee. Enemies in every corridor. The crown was restored. Yes, but it was fragile. Republican sentiment still simmered. Puritan leaders resented the king's pleasures. Parliament watched him closely, and foreign powers waited to see whether Charles would falter like his father. The king understood something crucial. Survival was no longer about winning battles. It was about mastering politics. He navigated religious conflict with delicate precision. He balanced foreign alliances without committing to any one nation. And he kept his inner council divided enough that no single minister could gain too much power. But the ghosts of war still hunted him. He could never forget the night he watched his father executed. He could never forget the soldiers who hunted him across England. He could never forget the cold humiliation of begging for support from kings who laughed behind his back. These memories shaped his rule more than Parliament ever realized. The Great Plague and fire trials of a reborn nation, the Restoration did not spare Charles from catastrophe. In 1665, the Great Plague ripped London. Thousands dying weekly, citizens fleeing, businesses collapsing. Charles supervised from a distance, making sure government did not fall apart, even as clerks and ministers died in droves. A year later, the Great Fire of London devoured the city. 4 days' flames painted the sky red. Nearly 13,000 homes burned. Charles rode into the smoke himself, directing bucket lines, hiving orders, inspiring the people who had once crowned him with hope. This was not the sheltered prince of St. James's Palace. This was a man who had slept on foreign floors, fled through forests, and learned the price of inaction through plague, fire, political crisis, and war. Charles II held the monarchy together with charisma, intelligence, and the hardened instincts of a survivor. The people soon came to believe something remarkable. England had not simply regained a king. It had gained a ruler shaped by fire, shaped by exile, shaped by King Reborn. 6. The Warborn King's Final Reckoning, and the Empire He Forged, King Charles II. Title: Warborn Kings. Rise of the British Empire, the final years of Charles' eyes' reign unfolded like the calm before a storm, steady, controlled, yet filled with the heavy knowledge that time was closing in. He had survived wars, exile, plague, and fire. He had outplayed enemies in Parliament, outmaneuvered foreign threats, and outlived almost every man who once tried to erase the monarchy from England. But now, in the late 1680s, Charles carried a burden heavier than any battlefield wound: the future of the crown itself. England's political landscape was dangerously unstable. The tension between Catholicism and Protestantism had become a ticking fuse. His brother and heir, James, staunchly Catholic, rigid, and uncompromising, was seen by Parliament and the people as a looming threat to English freedoms. Charles knew it. He had always known it. Yet the king, who could outwit generals and seduce entire courts, struggled with the one thing he could never fully control: his own family. Still, Charles pushed forward. He strengthened the Royal Navy, transforming it into one of Europe's most feared maritime forces. He bolstered the empire's foothold in the Americas and the East Indies, laying foundations that would one day help Britain dominate global trade. And he continued to charm London with his presence, walking among the people, laughing with them, human in a way no Stuart before him had dared to be. Despite the scandals, the mistrusses, the political games, the debts, and the shadows of betrayal, the people adored him. To them, Charles was the merry monarch, the king who brought back music, theater, celebration, and the joy stolen by the Puritan regime. But in private, his health began to fail. Subtle at first: fatigue, faint episodes, a shortness of breath, then, suddenly, catastrophic. On February 2nd, 1685, Charles II collapsed in Whitehall Palace. Ministers rushed in. Courtiers panicked. Physicians tried every remedy known to the age: bloodletting oils, heated stones, even crushed herbs, but none could slow the rapid decline. As the king drifted in and out of consciousness, he requested something unusual: to be shaved. to be dressed cleanly, to look presentable when meeting death. It was dignity, not fear, that guided him. In his final hours, Charles apologized to those around him for taking such a long time to die. Even at the end, he carried the same wit, the same humor, the same warmth that had endeared him to an entire nation. He asked his brother James to take care of his mistakes. He greeted those who came to say goodbye with calm acceptance. He confessed privately, converted to Catholicism in his last moments, and drifted away peacefully. On February 6, 1685, the Warborn King died not on a battlefield, but in his bed, surrounded by loyalists, enemies, and history itself. Conclusion: the legacy of a Warborn King.